Moving on to the plate, I rolled out a thin sheet of clay and used an actual plate as the template to cut out the circle. My roller isn't wide enough for one big sheet, so I made 2 pieces and bonded them together with bacon bond. I set the clay circle back onto the real plate so it could act as a mold, then smoothed the whole surface with isopropyl alcohol to get that clean ceramic feel. Once it looked even, I used my cutting tool to carve shallow grooves around the base, just to give the plate a bit more shape and personality. After smoothing that out, I moved to the top and cleaned up the edges. Lots of smoothing here, just refining the curves so it feels like a finished plate. I added one more subtle groove along the rim of the plate to help it read more like an actual dish, rather than a flat disc of clay. Smoothing everything again because that's practically half of sculpting, the plate goes finally into the oven to bake. Now on to the apple. I started by pressing together layers and layers of aluminum foil, shaping it until it vaguely resembled, well, an apple. Rough, but close enough to start with. Once I had the basic shape, I wrapped it in thin sheets of clay, building up the form gradually. At this stage, it's all about getting the volume without worrying about the perfection and all the details, just the shape. I added rolls of clay across the top and the bottom to help build that classic apple dome, blending each piece in so the curves look natural. I kept adding layer after layer until the apple finally felt full and rounded. When it looked close to where I wanted it, I wrapped the whole thing in one large, thin sheet of clay and blended the seams together. With the main shape done, I added small lumps around the bottom. These act like the apple's feet, helping it sit right and giving it that natural, slightly uneven base. I carved out a bite mark on one side of the apple, removing the clay to expose the foil at the center. This is where eventually the eye will sit. After shaping the bite area, I smoothed the whole apple with alcohol and pressed a small hole at the top so I could add a stem later. For the stem, I had bent a small piece of armature wire into shape and wrapped it with a thin layer of clay. Then I poked and prodded it until it started looking like a believable stem. I used my cutting tool to carve a wood-like texture into the stem, giving it some grain and unevenness so it didn't look too perfect. Next, I cut out a tiny clay leaf to sit at the end of the stem, just a little extra detail to break up the shapes and make it feel more alive. I attached the leaf and prodded it up with aluminum foil so it wouldn't droop when I baked it. Once it came out baked and solid, I cut open the apple again and removed the foil core. This gave me space to build out the inside. I pressed thin layers of clay into the bite area to create the interior flesh of the apple, blending everything so it felt cohesive with the outer layer. After that, I shaped a shallow crater in the center of the bite mark. That's where the eyeball will sit later on, so it needed a little pocket to rest in. With the shape in place, I added rolled bits of clay around the crater to form eyelids. One on the top, one on the bottom, and additional smaller folds to build up the depth. I blended the eyelids into the apple so they felt like they were a part of the same structure rather than just sitting on the surface. Using my Explorer tool, I carved in smaller wrinkles and details around the eyelids, building that layered, organic look. I brushed everything down with alcohol to soften the harsh edges and pull the forms together. Before baking, I pressed the end of a toothbrush into the clay to add subtle, porous texture across the apple's flesh surface. Now it's time to paint. Since the hand already had a flesh tone base, I started layering on purplish grays with my airbrush, gradually deepening the color at the knuckles and creases for an unnatural, kind of undead look. I leaned into this more supernatural color palette, a soft mix of purples, grays, and reds, because a normal looking hand felt a little too plain to me. The ghoulish approach fit the mood of the project a little bit better in my opinion. As I built up the color, I made sure the reddish tones settled into deeper lines and especially around the fingertips and nails. It helps the hand feel a little more unsettling, but in a good way. Once the hand was where I wanted it, I gave each fingernail a solid coat of light tan to bring out the shape and contrast. For the plate, I brushed on a thick layer of light stone gray and used a paper towel to dab away some of the paint afterwards. This gives it a slightly textured, aged look without going overboard. Moving to the apple, I started airbrushing a bright red base coat, then slowly worked in deeper reds and shadows to build up some of the dimension. I added a bit of orange, yellowish across the top and ended up speckling it around the apple to break up the surface and get more of a natural apple variation going. Inside the bite area, I switched to a lighter flesh tone, kind of a pale creamy tan to match the inside of a real apple and highlight the eyelid structure. Back to the plate, I brushed on a thin black-brown wash. The eyelids on the apple got their own dark brown wash. It helps the folds stand out and makes the eye area feel a bit more dramatic. I painted the eyeball a bright white and gave the leaf a deep green base, keeping everything bold so it reads clearly from a distance. The plate got a final pass with a darker metallic brown wash. I kept the coat thick, then dabbed off the raised areas so the texture felt worn and a little rustic. Back to the hand. Added more detail to the fingernails using darker washes, just to give it a more grimy, undead look. For the apple's eye, I ended up forgetting to film this part, but for a quick explanation, I painted the iris a warm yellow tone. Once the whole piece was dry, I sealed everything with a satin varnish. With the painting done, I realized the concrete inside the hand still wasn't heavy enough to support everything. The weight wasn't balanced, so the hand couldn't stand on its own like I had originally planned. So I had to come up with a better idea to support my model, and that was to create a concrete base. Well, that fell apart. So I scrapped the concrete idea and moved on to building a base from scratch. I cut out a square of XPS foam and started shaping it into a rough platform for the hand to sit on. To hide the seam where the wrist meets the base, I tore small chunks of foam and glued them around the arm, layering piece by piece until it started looking like a pile of rock and dirt forming naturally around it. I felt like the wrist looked a little too plain, so I figured adding something organic around it would help. Roots and vines seemed like the right move here, so something that looked like it was growing up from the ground and gripping the wrist, I thought would give it a little more visual interest. I started planning out the root structure using armature wire, wrapping it gently around the hand so I could get a sense of how the shapes would flow. Once I had the layout, I added smaller offshoot wire, like branching pieces that would act like secondary roots, twisting in their own direction. Then, switching to cosclay, I began building the main vine around the wire. Cosclay's flexibility makes it perfect for this since it can bend after baking without cracking. With the clay on, I took my tool and started shaping the wood texture. Little grooves, uneven lines, and subtle twists to make it look like an actual root rather than a smooth coil. After I had that, I brushed everything down with isopropyl alcohol to soften the details and clean up the transitions. After baking, I wrapped the finished root around the hand to test the fit. It lined up nicely, so I moved on to painting the base before installing it. For the base, I brushed on a coat of black tone Mod Podge to seal the foam and give myself a dark foundation to paint on. When that dried, I mixed the leftover concrete with some spackling paste and gray paint. I spread the mixture across the base to create a rocky surface, making sure to press into the cracks and texture to add some weight and grit. Once that layer had dried, I attached the baked root pieces to the base. Starting from the wrist and working outward, I added more clay snakes where I needed extra branches that would spread across the base. After blending in the new sections, I carved the same wood grain pattern into them, so everything matched and looked more organic. With everything baked and assembled, I painted the root system with a light reddish brown base coat, trying to keep the undertones warm and earthy. Once that first color dried, I washed the entire root structure with a dark brown wash. I wiped down some of the wash so it settled into the grooves without darkening the whole piece too much. After the roots were done, I coated the base with a light gray stone color. It helped bring out the texture with the concrete spackle mix underneath. I managed to not record the final assembly of this project and the final drying, so with everything finally painted and assembled, it's finally time for the big reveal. So let's take a look at how this thing turned out. And that's a wrap on this build. A strange little project, but a fun one from start to finish. It took a few twists, a couple fixes, and a lot of smoothing, but I'm pretty happy with how this came together. So thanks for sticking around to see the whole thing unfold, and I hope you come again.